The rain hammered Seattle's streets with the fury of a decade's worth of unspoken grievances, each droplet a tiny fist against pavement that had seen too many footsteps and not enough care. James Sullivan hunched his broad shoulders against the deluge, one hand gripping the steering wheel of his '09 Ford F-150, the other resting on the gear shift worn smooth by 17 years of working hands. In the back seat, Rosalie, Rosie to everyone who mattered, hummed a melody from her piano recital, her 7-year-old voice rising and falling with the rhythm of windshield wipers that had seen better days. The digital clock on the dashboard blinked 9:47 p.m., too late for a school night, but the recital had run long, and James had never been the type to rush a child through her moment of pride. Single guardianship meant constant negotiation between what should be and what actually was. He'd learned that lesson 2 years ago when Margaret's hospital bed became the center of their universe, when architects' meetings gave way to bedside vigils, when blueprints for skyscrapers were replaced by instructions for morphine dosages. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Pine Street in stark relief. James caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. 58 years old, hair more salt than pepper, now lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he'd won the National Design Award in 2014. Back then he'd stood on stages in tailored suits, shaking hands with mayors and developers, discussing load-bearing walls and aesthetic vision with people who treated architecture like religion. Now he wore flannel shirts with patched elbows and knew more about wood grain than he did about zoning regulations. Rosie's humming stopped abruptly. Her small voice cut through the drum of rain on metal. "Grandpa, look." James followed her pointing finger across the intersection. A woman stumbled along the sidewalk, one heel missing from what had probably been expensive shoes, the kind that cost more than his monthly mortgage. Her evening gown, dark silk designer label if he had to guess, clung to her frame like seaweed on a drowning victim. Mascara ran in black rivers down pale cheeks that might have been beautiful if they weren't contorted in something between rage and despair. 3 luxury sedans passed her without slowing. Their headlights swept across her like searchlights hunting escaped prisoners, then abandoned her to darkness. The woman's heel caught in a sidewalk grate and she went down hard, palms slapping concrete pearls scattering from a broken necklace like tiny moons fleeing a dying star. James eased his foot onto the brake pedal, the truck's worn brake pads squealing in protest. Every instinct he'd honed over 30 years of marriage and 25 years of fatherhood told him to keep driving. Seattle had 50,000 stories just like this one. People making bad choices, ending up in bad situations, learning hard lessons the hard way. Not his circus, not his monkeys. He had a 7-year-old in the back seat who needed to be home bathed in bed by 10:30 at the latest. But Rosie's voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with her small frame. "She looks like Grandma Margaret, when Grandma got lost in the rain before you saved her. You told me that story." James's hands tightened on the wheel. The wedding band he still wore brushed platinum Margaret's choice because she'd said gold was too common pressed into his finger. 28 years of marriage compressed into that simple circle of metal. 28 years and then 8 months of watching cancer devour the woman who'd made him understand that buildings were just buildings but people were cathedrals. The memory hit him like it always did, sharp and immediate. Margaret, at 25, standing in the rain outside a clinic after her 3rd failed nursing school interview. She'd been soaked through mascara, running too proud to call her parents, too stubborn to admit defeat. James had been heading to a site meeting, running late, already mentally reviewing his presentation on sustainable materials. But he'd seen her crying, and something in his chest had cracked open. He'd given her his coat, driven her home, listened to her talk about how she wasn't smart enough, wasn't good enough, would never be enough. 6 months later, they'd been engaged. 2 years after that, married. She'd gotten into nursing school on her 4th try and graduated top of her class. She'd spent 22 years healing people in ways that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with being seen, being heard, being told you were enough exactly as you were. James pulled the truck to the curb. Rain battered the windshield so hard he could barely see the woman now struggling to stand, one hand clutching a parking meter for support. Rosie had already unbuckled her seatbelt, her trumpet case forgotten on the seat beside her. He stepped out into the deluge. Water hit his flannel shirt with the force of tiny bullets soaking through to skin in seconds. The woman looked up as his shadow fell across her eyes, wild with something that might have been fear or might have been fury, hard to tell the difference when someone's world was actively collapsing. Her voice came out sharp, defensive, a blade wrapped in silk. "Just walk away. I don't need your pity." James stood his ground, rain plastering his graying hair to his forehead. 30 years of construction sites and client meetings had taught him how to read people, how to separate bluster from actual threat. This woman wasn't dangerous. She was drowning on dry land. Up close, her dress revealed itself as something that belonged in magazines James had never bought and parties he'd never attended. Even soaked through, ruined by rain and pavement grit, it probably cost more than he'd earned last month building custom shelving for the Green Lake Community Center. Her jewelry, what remained of it after the pearl necklace had scattered, spoke of wealth James had once courted for contracts, then abandoned for something more substantial. He kept his voice level, the same tone he'd used with Margaret during her worst chemo days, when pain made her mean, didn't offer pity, offering shelter. There's a difference. The woman tried to wave him off, but her coordination betrayed her. Not drunk, James had seen enough of that to know the signs. This was shock exhaustion, the body's way of saying it had reached its absolute limit. She slipped again, caught herself on his outstretched arm, then jerked away like his touch had burned her. A string of what remained of her pearls broke completely, beads bouncing across wet concrete in every direction. She stared at them like they represented something more than jewelry, some final tether to a life that had just come spectacularly undone. James moved closer, keeping his movements slow, deliberate, the way you approached a wounded animal. "You're going to catch pneumonia out here. My granddaughter's watching from the truck, so humor me and let me help you before she decides to come out here herself." Something in his matter-of-fact tone seemed to penetrate whatever walls this woman had built around herself. Her shoulders slumped, fight draining out like water through cupped fingers. She looked past him to where Rosie's small face pressed against the truck's rain-streaked window, eyes wide with concern that had no business belonging to a 7-year-old. The woman's voice came out smaller this time, almost lost in the rain's percussion. "My phone died. I can't remember where I was supposed to go, just that it wasn't. I couldn't stay where I was." James noticed her shivering, the kind that started deep in the core and worked its way out. He shrugged off his flannel shirt, revealing a t-shirt underneath that had seen better decades. The shirt was already soaked, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough. He draped it over her shoulders. "Where do you live?" She mumbled an address James recognized from the upscale neighborhood overlooking Elliott Bay, the kind of place where doormen knew your name and elevators required key cards. Then she shook her head, water flying from dark hair that had probably been styled with professional care 6 hours ago. "Not there. Can't go there tonight." James glanced back at Rosie, who'd cracked the truck door open despite explicit instructions to stay put. His protective instincts warred with the lesson Margaret had spent 7 years drilling into their granddaughter's head. Good people don't walk past someone who needs help. Good people show up. Good people do the hard thing because it's the right thing, not because it's easy or convenient or makes sense. The woman swayed on her feet. James caught her elbow, steadied her with a grip that was firm without being aggressive. 30 years of handling tools had taught him exactly how much pressure was support versus control. He made the decision. "My apartment's 3 blocks east. You can dry off, use a phone, figure out your next move. No expectations, no pressure. Just basic human decency in a city that seems to have forgotten what that looks like." The woman studied his face with eyes that were probably sharp as scalpels when they weren't clouded by rain and whatever catastrophe had put her on this sidewalk. She was searching for ulterior motives, James realized, scanning him the way security systems scanned for threats. It said something bleak about her life that kindness registered as suspicious. Finally she nodded. She bent to remove her remaining heel, nearly falling again in the process. James caught her, and this time she didn't pull away, just stood there in her bare feet, ruined designer dress hanging off her frame, looking like every illusion she'd ever believed about herself had just shattered on Seattle pavement. They made their way back to the truck. Rosie had already climbed to the front passenger seat, making room in the back. James helped the woman into the vehicle, her movements uncoordinated, running on fumes and whatever last reserves of dignity she could scrape together. Rosie twisted around, studying their unexpected passenger with the unfiltered curiosity only children possessed. "I'm Rosie. That's my grandpa James. He always helps people. It's his thing." The woman pulled James's soaked flannel shirt tighter around her shoulders. "I'm Catherine Reed." Rosie's face lit up with recognition that had nothing to do with knowing the name, "like the princess in my library book." "Are you a princess too?" Catherine's laugh came out brittle broken glass wrapped in sound. "Hardly. Just someone who made some catastrophically poor choices tonight." James shifted the truck into drive, windshield wipers working overtime against rain that showed no signs of stopping. Rosie launched into an animated recap of her piano recital, oblivious to the tension radiating from their passenger like heat from asphalt in August. She described each piece she'd played, every note she'd hit or missed, the way Mrs. Chen had smiled when Rosie finished her solo. But halfway through describing the cookies at intermission, Rosie's stream of consciousness took an unexpected turn, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper but carried clearly in the truck's confined space. "Grandpa, when Grandma Margaret got lost in the rain, you saved her too, right? Before I was born." James's chest tightened around breath that suddenly didn't want to come. He should have seen this coming. Rosie had always been too observant for her own good, making connections most adults missed. It was a gift and a curse, that particular brand of intelligence. He kept his eyes on the road, on streetlights reflecting off wet asphalt, on anything except the rearview mirror, where he knew Catherine Reed's expression had shifted from defensive to curious. "Yes, Squirt. Grandma got caught in a bad storm once, long time ago. Good memory." Rosie seemed satisfied with this confirmation. She turned back to Catherine, launching into a new topic, something about the trumpet case she'd left in the back seat, how brass instruments needed special care in wet weather. But James felt Catherine's eyes on him now, reassessing, recalibrating, trying to fit this new piece into whatever puzzle she was working out in her head. They rounded the corner onto Pine Street. James's building rose 5 stories, all brick and iron fire escapes, the kind of pre-war construction that had been solid in 1923 and remained solid through sheer stubborn refusal to acknowledge the passage of time. No elevator, no doorman, no keycard access. Just a heavy door that stuck in humid weather and stairs that creaked on the 3rd and 7th step like clockwork. James found parking half a block down killed the engine. The rain had softened to a steady drumming rather than an outright assault. He helped Catherine from the truck, her bare feet pale against dark pavement. She kicked off her remaining heel, wincing as gravel bit into soft skin, unaccustomed to anything harder than Persian rugs. They climbed the stairs slowly. Catherine made it 2 flights before her legs gave out completely. James caught her before she hit the landing, lifted her in arms that had once carried Margaret up these same stairs when chemo had stolen her strength. Catherine's head lolled against his shoulder, unconscious, or simply surrendered to exhaustion, impossible to tell which. Rosie darted ahead, fishing the apartment key from James's jacket pocket with practiced ease. She had the door open by the time James reached the 3rd-floor landing, 3B's brass numbers reflecting hallway light that flickered every 17 seconds like it had for the past 3 years. The apartment welcomed them with lingering scents. James had long stopped noticing morning coffee that had been cheap even before inflation hit sawdust from the makeshift workshop he'd set up in what used to be the dining room, and something else, something deeper. Home. The smell of a place where people lived actual lives instead of performing them. James laid Catherine on the sofa, a piece he'd built himself 5 years ago from reclaimed oak. Not fancy, not matching anything else in the room, but solid, built to last. He arranged her carefully, mindful of the way her evening gown had twisted during the climb, then grabbed the wool blanket Margaret had crocheted during her final winter. Rosie appeared with towels she could barely carry, her small face serious with the responsibility of helping. "Is she going to be okay, Grandpa?" James ran a hand through his wet hair, scattering droplets. "She will be. Get yourself into dry clothes. I'll make hot chocolate." While Rosie changed, James moved through the apartment's familiar rhythms. He found Margaret's old sweats in the back of his closet, clothes he'd kept meaning to donate but never quite managed to let go. A flannel shirt of his own soft from 1,000 washings. Clean towels. These he left folded on the coffee table within Catherine's reach whenever she woke. The kitchen was barely large enough to turn around in galley style with appliances that predated smartphone technology. James put milk on to heat measured cocoa powder with the precision he'd once applied to architectural measurements. Through the doorway, he could see Rosie emerging from her room in dinosaur pajamas, hair still damp, but combed ready for whatever came next with the resilience only children seem to possess. Catherine stirred on the sofa. Her eyes opened slowly, taking in unfamiliar surroundings with the careful assessment of someone who'd woken in strange places before. She pushed herself upright, the wool blanket sliding to reveal her ruined dress, and for a moment something like panic crossed her features. James stepped into her line of sight, keeping distance between them. Hands visible, non-threatening. Bathroom's first door on the left. Dry clothes on the table. Take your time. She stared at the folded garments like they were artifacts from another civilization. These were your wife's. Statement, not question. James wasn't sure how she'd known, but something in her voice suggested she understood the weight of what he was offering. He met her gaze directly. Margaret wouldn't have wanted them gathering dust when someone needed them. She wasn't sentimental about things, just people. Catherine took the clothes and disappeared into the bathroom. James heard the lock click good. She still had enough self-preservation to maintain boundaries. Then the sound of running water. He finished the hot chocolate, poured 3 mugs, and was arranging them on the kitchen table when Rosie climbed into her usual chair. She pulled out her sketch pad, the one Margaret had given her 6 months before the end. Already it was half filled with crayon drawings of flowers and houses and stick figure families that always included 3 people now instead of 4. Rosie selected a purple crayon with the seriousness of an artist choosing their palette, then began drawing what looked like clouds and rain, and something that might have been a rainbow or might have been a bridge, hard to tell with 7-year-old symbolism. The bathroom door opened. Catherine emerged, transformed in a way that had nothing to do with clean clothes. Without makeup, without the armor of her evening wear, she looked younger than whatever age James would have guessed. Vulnerable. The sweatpants were indeed too large, rolled at the waist and ankles. His flannel shirt engulfed her frame sleeves, pushed up to free her hands. Her feet were bare toenails painted deep burgundy, the only remaining evidence of the woman who'd stumbled down Pine Street an hour ago. She stood in the kitchen doorway, taking in the cramped space, the chipped mugs, the worn linoleum that James kept promising himself he'd replace. Her eyes lingered on the height marks penciled on the wall. Rosie's growth tracked year by year, and higher up, faded but still visible, a mark that read, Margaret 30th birthday. James gestured to the empty chair. Hot chocolate. Nothing fancy, but it's warm. Catherine sat slowly like her body had forgotten how chairs worked. She wrapped her hands around the mug, and James noticed they were trembling, not from cold anymore, from something deeper, something that had been building long before tonight's rain. Rosie pushed her drawing across the table. I made this for you, so you'll feel better. 3 stick figures standing under what was definitely a rainbow now that James looked closer. One tall one, small one, medium, with long dark hair. All holding hands. All smiling with those wide crayon grins that suggested a world where problems were temporary and solutions were as simple as not letting go. Catherine's hand trembled harder as she accepted the drawing. For a long moment she just stared at it, something working behind her eyes that James recognized from his own mirror on bad days, the moment when you realized you'd been running on empty for so long you'd forgotten what full felt like. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, Thank you, Rosie. That's very kind. James had spent enough years reading blueprints to know when a structure was sound and when it was one strong wind away from collapse. Catherine Reed, for all her expensive clothes and careful composure, was actively disintegrating. He'd seen it before in Margaret's oncology ward, that particular flavor of breaking that happened when people finally stopped holding everything together through sheer force of will. He set his own mug down, kept his voice level. You don't have to tell us anything, but you're safe here. Whatever happened tonight, whatever you're running from it, doesn't reach into this apartment unless you let it. Catherine looked up at him. then really looked, and James saw her doing math in her head, calculating trust versus risk, measuring his words against a lifetime of learning which promises meant something and which were just noise people made to fill uncomfortable silence. Rosie broke the moment by yawning so wide her jaw cracked. James checked the clock above the sink. 10:47 p.m., well past reasonable bedtime, even on special occasions. He stood, began clearing mugs. "Time for bed, Squirt. School tomorrow." Rosie slid from her chair, but paused beside Catherine, studying her with that unnerving 7-year-old intensity. "Are you going to be here in the morning, or are you leaving like the rain does?" Catherine's composure cracked visibly. She reached out, almost touched Rosie's hair, then pulled back like she'd remembered she didn't have permission. "I don't know, sweetheart, but thank you for the drawing. I'll keep it somewhere safe." Rosie seemed to accept this answer. She hugged her grandfather with the full-body commitment only children managed, then disappeared down the hallway toward her room. James heard her bedroom door close, the familiar creak of her bed frame as she climbed in. He turned back to Catherine, found her staring at the kitchen wall where he'd hung Rosie's school schedule, the fire department newsletter, a crayon drawing of what was labeled Grandpa's Workshop in wobbly letters, a refrigerator covered in magnetic poetry and grocery lists and photographs held in place by Seattle tourist magnets Margaret had collected ironically. Catherine spoke without looking at him. "This is a real home. You've built something real here." James leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Real just means people show up, day after day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." She turned to face him fully. "How long has your wife been gone?" The question didn't hurt the way it used to. 2 years had sanded down the sharpest edges, left something more like ache than agony. 2 years in October. Cancer. We had 8 good months after diagnosis. More than some people get. Catherine's expression shifted to something James couldn't quite read. "And you stopped being an architect to take care of her." Not a question. Somehow she'd already pieced that part together, maybe from the drawings she'd seen, maybe from the way James moved through this apartment, like a man who'd consciously chosen it over something bigger, shinier, more impressive. James nodded. "Buildings last decades. Love lasts forever. I chose right." The words settled between them like sediment heavy with truth that didn't need decoration. Catherine stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language, like the concept of choosing people over career was so alien she couldn't quite parse the grammar. Finally, she spoke, her voice carrying exhaustion that went bone deep. "I need to tell you what happened tonight, what I'm running from. You deserve to know what you're inviting into your home." James shook his head. "Only if you want to. Otherwise, it can wait until you've slept. Slept real sleep, not just collapsed from running out of options." But Catherine had already started talking, words spilling out like she'd been holding them in so long they'd built up pressure. "I'm a CEO, Reed and Associates. We plan corporate events, galas, product launches. 50 million in revenue last year. I built it from nothing over 20 years. Tonight was supposed to be our biggest event of the season. Instead, my business partner, my fiancé, announced our wedding date on stage. Didn't ask me, didn't discuss it, just decided and announced like I was another line item on his merger proposal." She laughed, and it was the ugliest sound James had heard in months. "I walked out, left 500 people waiting for speeches I was supposed to give, got in the car, told my driver to drop me somewhere I could think, ended up at a bar, then another bar. Then walking in the rain, wondering when exactly I'd stopped being a person and became an asset to be managed." James listened without interrupting. Sometimes people needed to empty themselves out before they could start filling back up with anything healthier. Margaret had taught him that sitting beside her hospital bed while she talked about all the trips they'd never take and grandchildren they'd never meet and years they'd been promised but wouldn't get. Catherine pulled his flannel shirt tighter around herself. "I saw the articles about you. When I was waiting for you to come back from tucking in, Rosie, I looked you up on my phone before it died completely. James Sullivan and Associates Architecture, winner of the 2014 National Design Award, designed the Seattle Convention Center expansion that everyone said was impossible, then just vanished. People in architecture forums still speculate about what happened to you." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. That life ended when Margaret got sick. She asked me to choose. I chose her. No regrets. Catherine's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been fury. Don't you understand? You gave up everything. Your career, your reputation, everything you'd built. James moved to the sink, began washing mugs to give his hands something to do. I gave up buildings, kept everything that mattered. He could feel her staring at him, trying to comprehend a value system so different from her own, it might as well be quantum physics. The silence stretched until James finished washing, dried his hands on a towel Margaret had embroidered with a joke about real men doing dishes. Catherine stood abruptly. I should go. I've imposed enough. If you could just call me a car. James cut her off. It's nearly midnight. You're exhausted. Your phone's dead. You said yourself you can't go home. Stay the night. Figure out tomorrow when tomorrow comes. She wavered, and James saw the exact moment when her last reserves of strength gave out. She sank back into the chair, head in her hands, and he heard her breath hitch in a way that meant crying, but silent the kind people did when they'd learned tears were weakness. He spoke quietly. Margaret's clothes are yours for as long as you need them. Couch is comfortable. I've slept there enough times to vouch for it. Morning comes whether we're ready or not, but at least you can face it rested. Catherine didn't respond, just sat there with her face hidden, shoulders shaking. James gave her space, moved down the hallway to check on Rosie. His granddaughter had already fallen asleep. Mr. Bear clutched in one arm, the other flung across her pillow like she was reaching for something in her dreams. He stood in her doorway, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, this small, perfect person who'd been dropped into his life when his son and daughter-in-law died in that car accident, when grief was still so fresh from losing Margaret that James had thought he had nothing left to give. But Rosie had taught him different, had shown him that love wasn't a finite resource that depleted. It was something that grew to fill whatever space you gave. It multiplied instead of divided, expanded instead of diminished. When James returned to the kitchen, he found Catherine exactly where he'd left her. She'd stopped crying, moved into that blank, exhausted state past tears. He pulled a spare pillow and blanket from the hall closet, set them on the sofa. She looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Why are you being kind to me? You don't know me. I could be anyone. James considered the question, thought about all the easy answers he could give. Instead, he chose truth. Because someone needed help. That's reason enough. And because Rosie's watching how I act, learning what it means to be human from every choice I make. I want her to grow up knowing that helping people isn't optional. It's who we are. Catherine's laugh came out broken. You're a better person than most. James shook his head. I'm just a guy who made some choices, lost some things, kept what mattered. You get enough years on you, you figure out the difference between what looks important and what actually is. He moved toward his bedroom, paused at the doorway. Bathrooms stocked with basics. Kitchens open if you get hungry. Lock the front door if it makes you feel safer. You're not a prisoner here, Catherine. Just someone who needed shelter from the storm. In his room, James sat on the edge of the bed he'd once shared with Margaret. Her side still had the indent from 28 years of her weight, a ghost impression in memory foam that refused to forget. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through photos until he found the one he was looking for. Margaret at 25, soaked through, standing outside the nursing school that had just rejected her for the third time. James had taken this photo after driving her home after she'd stopped crying long enough to laugh at how ridiculous she looked. She'd made him promise to keep it as a reminder that the worst days could turn into the best stories if you just kept going. He set the phone on his nightstand, turned out the light. Through the thin walls, he could hear Catherine moving around the bathroom door, closing, water running. Then silence, then footsteps returning to the living room. The creak of the sofa as she settled. James stared at his ceiling, at patterns of streetlight filtered through curtains Margaret had sewn by hand. Tomorrow would bring complications. Catherine Reed wasn't some stranger he'd never see again. She was a CEO with resources and connections and a life that would come looking for her. But tomorrow was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, he'd done what Margaret would have wanted. He'd seen someone in the rain and stopped. Everything else was just details to sort through when daylight made them easier to see. Morning light filtered through curtains that had once been cream-colored but had faded to something closer to bone. Catherine woke to the smell of coffee and voices, one deep and measured, one high and animated. For 3 disoriented seconds she couldn't place where she was, then the previous night crashed back with the subtlety of a freight train. She sat up slowly. The wool blanket had twisted around her legs during whatever restless sleep she'd managed. Her phone sat on the coffee table, plugged into a charger she hadn't noticed last night, screen showing 6:47 a.m. and 93 missed notifications. Catherine stared at the number, felt her chest constrict. Through the kitchen doorway she could see James at the stove, spatula in hand, while Rosie, perched on a chair, dragged close enough to watch his technique. The girl's hair stuck up at angles, suggesting she'd slept hard, and she wore mismatched socks with her pajamas like coordinating colors was an adult concern she hadn't yet inherited. Rosie spotted Catherine first. "You're still here. Grandpa said you might leave early, but I told him you wouldn't because Mr. Bear helped you sleep and Mr. Bear always works." James turned, and Catherine felt herself being assessed with the same careful attention he'd probably given load-bearing walls in his previous life. He gestured toward the coffee pot. "Fresh. Mugs in the cabinet above. Rosie and I are attempting pancakes, but the jury's still out on whether they're edible." Catherine stood Margaret's sweatpants sliding down her hips until she caught them. She felt stripped bare without her morning routine. The shower precisely timed to 8 minutes. The moisturizer applied in specific order, the suit selected based on which clients she'd be facing. Here she was, just skin and borrowed clothes, and 93 notifications she didn't want to read. She poured coffee into a mug that declared "World's Okayest Dad" in faded letters. The first sip hit her system like a declaration of war against whatever fog had settled in her brain overnight. Not great coffee, not the single-origin, ethically sourced beans her assistant ordered in bulk, but real, honest. The kind people drank because they needed caffeine, not because they were making a statement about their refined palate. James flipped a pancake with more confidence than the lopsided result warranted. "Rosie's got school in 45 minutes. I'll walk her. Then I've got a project at the workshop that'll keep me busy most of the day. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. Lock clicks automatically when you leave if you decide to go." The casual offer settled something in Catherine's chest that had been clenched tight since she'd woken. No pressure, no expectations, just space and time and coffee that tasted like someone had made it without consulting market research. Rosie accepted a pancake that looked more like the state of Texas than anything circular, drowned it in syrup, with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never counted calories. "Can Miss Catherine walk with us?" She could see my school. It has a turtle named Professor Shellsworth in Mrs. Anderson's room. James glanced at Catherine, leaving the decision entirely to her. She should say no. Should call her assistant, arrange a car, get back to her apartment, and the crisis she'd created by walking out mid-gala. Every minute she delayed was another minute Preston would use to consolidate control, another board member who'd decide she was unstable, unreliable, unfit for leadership. But Catherine heard herself say yes anyway. 20 minutes later she was walking Seattle streets in borrowed clothes and shoes James had produced from somewhere, Margaret's running sneakers slightly too small, broken in by someone else's feet. Rosie walked between them, occasionally taking both their hands to swing herself forward over cracks in the sidewalk. The morning smelled like rain-washed pavement and coffee from shops just opening. Pedestrians passed without really seeing them, just another family in a city full of families, unremarkable, except for how remarkable the ordinariness felt to Catherine. No one recognized her without the armor of her professional persona. No one needed anything from her. She was just a woman in sweatpants walking a child to school. At the gates of Greenwood Elementary, Rosie hugged James with practiced ease, then surprised Catherine by wrapping small arms around her waist. "Thank you for not leaving in the rain. That's what happens in the sad movies Grandpa won't let me watch." Catherine felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd sealed over years ago with ambition and strategic planning. "I'm not going anywhere just yet, sweetheart." Rosie beamed, then darted off to join the stream of children flowing through doors covered in construction paper decorations. James watched until she disappeared inside the way Margaret had probably watched him leave for work 1,000 times, loving and letting go in the same breath. They turned back toward Pine Street. Catherine's phone had been vibrating steadily since she'd powered it on a digital heartbeat of crisis and consequence. James walked beside her without speaking, giving her space to process whatever decision was forming. Finally, she broke, "I need to tell you something about my mother, about why I can't just go back to my apartment and pretend last night didn't happen." James led them to a bench outside a corner bakery. The owner was just setting out the sandwich board advertising fresh cinnamon rolls. He waved at James, who returned the gesture with the familiarity of someone who'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to become part of its fabric. Catherine pulled out her phone, scrolled until she found the notification she'd been avoiding. "My mother had a stroke 4 days ago. Minor. She's stable. I was supposed to visit her the day before the gala, but I had a conference call that ran late. I told myself I'd go after the event. Then Preston made his announcement and everything just combusted." James waited. He was good at that, Catherine noticed, creating space for people to fill with truth instead of rushing to fill silence with platitudes. She continued, "My mother is Constance Reed, former surgical nurse, retired 15 years. She pushed me into business from the time I could hold a calculator. Said emotional work nursing, teaching anything involving caring for people, was a trap that left women dependent and disposable. She wanted me hard, successful, untouchable." The morning air carried the scent of baking bread. Catherine breathed it in, used it to anchor herself. "I haven't spoken to her in 6 months. We had an argument about the engagement to Preston. She said I was making the same mistake she did, choosing a man over my independence. I told her Preston was a business partnership, not a romance. She said that was worse, that I'd become so afraid of vulnerability I'd turned myself into a corporation instead of a person." James shifted on the bench and Catherine caught his expression, something that looked like understanding mixed with sadness. "Sounds like she was speaking from experience." Catherine nodded. "My father was a cardiac surgeon. Brilliant, demanding. He wanted a wife who'd manage his life, not build her own. Mom gave up her career, became his perfect hostess, his social coordinator, his unpaid assistant. Then when I was 12, he left her for a pharmaceutical rep 20 years younger. Mom got the house in the divorce. Dad got his reputation and a new family." She pulled up her call log, stared at the hospital number that had rung 7 times yesterday while she'd been orchestrating ice sculptures and coordinating speeches. The nurse who called said Mom's been asking for me, that the stroke affected her speech, but she keeps trying to say my name, and I was too busy building my empire to even pick up the phone. James's voice came quiet but firm. "You're picking up now. That counts for something." Catherine wanted to believe him. Instead, she showed him her email inbox, the emergency board meeting scheduled for Monday at 2 p.m., the messages from Preston that had progressed from apologetic to concerned to coldly threatening over the course of 7 hours. James read the subject lines without touching her phone. "What do you want to do?" The question landed like a punch. Catherine realized no one had asked her that in months, maybe years. People asked what she thought the company should do, what strategy would maximize returns, what clients needed to stay happy. But what Catherine wanted as a separate entity from her role as CEO, that question had stopped being relevant somewhere between her first million in revenue and her 10th. She heard herself say, "I want to see my mother. I want to look her in the eye and tell her she was right, that I built something impressive and empty, and I don't know how to fix it because fixing it means admitting I spent 20 years running in the wrong direction." James stood, offered his hand. "Then that's where we start. One thing at a time. The rest can wait." They walked to Harborview Medical Center, a distance Catherine would normally have driven, but found herself grateful for on foot. Movement helped, gave her brain something to do besides spiral through worst-case scenarios and exit strategies. The hospital smelled like every hospital Catherine had ever avoided, antiseptic and artificial flowers, and something underneath that might have been fear or might have been resignation. James stayed in the waiting room while Catherine signed in, got a visitor badge, took the elevator to the 4th floor where recovering stroke patients relearned how to speak, walk, reclaim pieces of themselves that had short-circuited overnight. Constance Reed looked smaller than Catherine remembered. She'd always been a force 5'2" of opinions and efficiency and standards no one could quite meet. Now she lay propped against pillows, right side slack, left hand, clutching a stress ball a physical therapist had probably prescribed. Her eyes tracked to Catherine standing in the doorway. Her mouth worked, forming sounds that almost made words. Kath, cat. Catherine crossed the room, pulled a chair close to the bed. "I'm here, Mom. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner." Constance's left hand reached out surprisingly strong when it gripped Catherine's fingers. Her speech came slow, slurred, fighting through neural pathways that had been damaged but not destroyed. "You came. Thought you wouldn't." Catherine felt tears burning, blinked them back. "I almost didn't. I was at a gala when you had the stroke. My assistant told me. I said I'd come after the event because 500 people were counting on me. Then my fiancé announced our wedding date without asking, and I realized I'd built a life where 500 strangers mattered more than my own mother." Constance's expression shifted, became more focused. Her left hand squeezed tighter, pulling Catherine closer. "Good. You walked out." Catherine laughed, the sound wet with tears. She'd stopped fighting. "Walked out. Ended up drunk and crying in the rain. A carpenter and his granddaughter saved me. I spent the night on their couch wearing his dead wife's sweatpants, and it was the first time in 10 years I've slept through the night without medication." Something that might have been a smile tugged at the left corner of Constance's mouth. "I was wrong. Pushing you. Made you hard. Too hard." The admission hit Catherine like a physical blow. Her mother had never apologized for anything, had worn her certainty like armor through marriages and divorces and decades of being right at the cost of being happy. Constance struggled with more words. "Your father. I gave up everything. He wanted nurse wife, support his career, then left anyway. I thought, if you were successful enough, rich enough, no man could hurt you." Her breathing became labored. Catherine reached for the call button, but Constance shook her head, used her working hand to gesture. "Wait, listen, this matters. But I made you afraid. Afraid to love. Afraid to need anyone. You became what I feared. Rich, successful, alone." Catherine's tears fell freely now. "I don't know how to be anything else. I've spent 20 years building walls and calling them boundaries. I'm engaged to a man I don't love who sees me as a business opportunity. I run a company that makes millions creating perfect moments for strangers, while I can't remember the last time I had a real conversation with anyone." Constance's eyes were bright, clearer than Catherine had seen them in years. "You have conversation now. With Carpenter." Catherine nodded. "James. He gave up his architecture career to care for his wife when she got cancer. Just walked away from everything he'd built because she asked him to choose. He tells me buildings last decades, but love lasts forever, like it's the simplest equation in the world." Constance's working hand patted Catherine's rhythm, unsteady but intention clear. "Simple doesn't mean easy. Means true. You know what to do. Just scared." A nurse appeared in the doorway, apologetic but firm about visiting hours and rest requirements. Catherine stood, but Constance held on, pulled her down for one more message delivered in labored syllables. "Go back to Carpenter. Learn how to build something real. Not empire. Home." Catherine kissed her mother's forehead, tasted salt and antiseptic and forgiveness that had taken 63 years and a stroke to arrive. "I love you, Mom. I should have said it more. Said it better. Said it when it wasn't a crisis." Constance's eyes drifted closed, exhausted by the effort of speaking, but her left hand gave one more squeeze before releasing Catherine to whatever came next. James was reading a battered paperback in the waiting room when Catherine emerged. He looked up, closed the book without marking his place. It was that kind of thriller, apparently forgettable enough to abandon mid-chapter. He read her face, asked the only question that mattered. "How is she?" Catherine sank into the chair beside him. "Tired. Trying." She basically told me to stop being an idiot and figure out what I actually want instead of what I think I should want. James smiled, the expression carving deeper lines around his eyes. Mothers have a gift for cutting through complexity. The transport van took Constance away. James and Catherine stood on the sidewalk as afternoon burned into evening, the sky turning shades of amber and rose. James spoke first. "You did it. Stood up for what mattered without backing down." Catherine felt the weight of what she'd just committed to. "I promised them 18% margins and corporate partnership conversion rates I've never formally tracked. If I'm wrong, they'll use it as proof that caring makes you a bad business person." James started walking toward his building. "Could happen, or you could prove building things that matter is the best business model there is." At a small bakery that smelled like yeast and butter and comfort, they stopped for lunch. The owner, a gray-haired woman whose name tag read Susan, greeted James like family, the usual. "And who's your friend?" James ordered 2 sandwiches, and Catherine didn't protest, even though she had opinions about carbs and processed meat and all the rules she'd constructed around eating that had less to do with health and more to do with control. Susan brought their food with a knowing smile. "You look like you could use some of my magic soup. It's Saturday, so it's the good stuff, chicken and vegetables and enough garlic to ward off whatever's chasing you." Catherine found herself accepting soup she hadn't ordered, eating it while James talked with Susan about her daughter's college applications and whether the new parking restrictions were helping or hurting local businesses. Real conversations about real concerns, no agenda beyond the basic human need for connection. Halfway through her soup, Catherine's purse started vibrating again. She'd forgotten about the work tablet she kept for emergencies, the one her assistant had remote access to for exactly these situations. She pulled it out, saw the notification. "Emergency board meeting moved to today, 2 p.m. Your attendance mandatory or face immediate termination proceedings." James read over her shoulder, "That's in 90 minutes." Catherine stared at the screen. She could make it if she left now. Called a car, went straight to the office without stopping at her apartment. She'd show up in borrowed clothes and yesterday's crisis clinging to her like smoke, but she'd be there. She'd fight for the company she'd built, the reputation she'd cultivated, the empire she'd convinced herself mattered more than anything. Or she could stay, let them vote her out. Walk away from 20 years of work and see what remained when you stripped away the title in the corner office and the power that came from controlling $50 million in annual revenue. James didn't offer advice. Just finished his sandwich while Catherine sat with her decision, feeling the weight of 2 decades pressing against the strange lightness that came from imagining their absence. Finally, she spoke the words, feeling like they belonged to someone braver. "If I go back now, I'll never leave. I'll convince myself the company needs me, that I can fix it from the inside, that one more quarter will turn things around. But the truth is, I stopped being a CEO who cares about meaning somewhere around year 5. I became someone who cares about winning. And I don't know if that person is worth saving." She typed out an email to her assistant, fingers shaking slightly. "Taking personal leave, effective immediately. Cancel all meetings. Board can proceed without me." Before she could second guess, she hit send. James's expression remained carefully neutral. "That was either the bravest thing I've seen in months or the most self-destructive. Sometimes hard to tell the difference until later." Catherine set her tablet face down on the table. "My mother gave up her career for a man who left her. I gave up everything that makes life worth living for a career that made me rich and miserable. Maybe there's a third option I haven't considered." They finished lunch while Catherine's tablet buzzed with incoming messages she didn't read. Susan brought them coffee and a slice of pie to share on the house because apparently she'd decided Catherine needed feeding beyond the merely nutritional. James walked Catherine back to his apartment building. On the stairs, step 3 creaking right on schedule, he paused. "I've got to head to the workshop. Project deadline Monday. You're welcome to come along if you want, or stay here, or go wherever you need to go. No judgment either way." Catherine surprised herself. "Can I watch you work? I've never seen furniture being made. Just bought it from catalogs and had people arrange it in spaces I barely used." The workshop occupied a converted garage behind James's building, accessed through an alley that smelled like Thai food and motor oil. Inside, sawdust caught afternoon light slanting through high windows. Tools hung on pegboard walls with the precision of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. James was building a bookshelf custom order for the public library's children's section. The wood was maple golden and smooth cut to proportions that would fit small readers. He showed Catherine the joints, explained how he'd designed it to be assembled without visible screws, because kids deserved beauty in functional objects. She watched him work for an hour, mesmerized by the steady rhythm of measuring and cutting and sanding. There was something meditative about it, the way each action built toward completion without shortcuts or compromises. James handed her a piece of sandpaper. "Want to try this section, needs smoothing before I can apply finish." Catherine took the sandpaper, began working the wood grain. Within minutes her arms ached from the repetitive motion. James corrected her technique with the grain, not against it, and she felt something shift in her understanding of how things were built. He spoke while they worked, voice nearly lost in the sound of sanding. "Margaret used to say I loved wood because it was honest. You can't lie to wood. It shows you exactly what it can bear. You sand against the grain, you get splinters. You work with it, you get strength." Catherine paused, examined the section she'd smoothed. "Is that why you left architecture? Because it stopped being about the wood and started being about the politics?" James set down his sanding block. "I left architecture because my wife was dying and she asked me to come home. But if I'm honest, I'd been looking for an exit for years. The clients stopped caring about building things that lasted. They wanted landmarks, vanity projects, something to put their name on. I wanted to build structures that served communities. By the end, we were speaking different languages, pretending to have the same conversation." Catherine felt the parallel land like a hammer blow. "That's exactly what happened with my company. I started Reed and Associates because I wanted to create meaningful experiences for people. Somewhere along the line, it became about impressing clients with how much money I could make them spend. The actual experience stopped mattering. Just the spectacle, the performance." James resumed sanding. "So what did you actually want? Back when you started, before it became about the money and the performance?" Catherine thought back to her first event, a small nonprofit fundraiser for literacy programs. 50 people in a church basement, decorations from the dollar store. But she'd spent weeks finding donated books as centerpieces, creating programs that highlighted specific students who'd learned to read. People had cried. Not because it was expensive or exclusive, but because it mattered. She told James this, heard the wistfulness in her own voice. He nodded like she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Sounds like you used to build something real. Question is whether that person is still in there somewhere, or if she got replaced completely by the version that chased quarterly targets." The challenge stung because it was fair. Catherine had spent years telling herself she'd evolved, matured, become more sophisticated. But sophisticated was just another word for disconnected. She'd traded authenticity for achievement and called it growth. They worked in companionable silence until Rosie burst through the workshop door, backpack bouncing full of news about Professor Shellsworth eating lettuce and arithmetic tests and recess drama that involved someone named Tyler being mean about someone else named Emma's new shoes. James listened with full attention, asking follow-up questions that showed he actually cared about the intricacies of second-grade social dynamics. Catherine watched them together, saw the ease of their relationship, and felt a longing so sharp it physically hurt. This was what she'd sacrificed. Not romantic love necessarily, though she'd sacrificed that too. But connection. The simple human pleasure of caring about someone else's day without calculating what it cost or what return it generated. Rosie noticed Catherine sitting in the corner. "Miss Catherine, did Grandpa teach you about sanding?" "He's really good at teaching. He taught me to make the birdhouse, and it only fell apart twice before I got it right." Catherine smiled despite the ache in her chest. "He's an excellent teacher, very patient with students who don't know what they're doing." Rosie climbed onto the workbench, swinging her legs. "Are you staying for dinner? Grandpa makes spaghetti on Saturdays, and it's actually good, even though the sauce comes from a jar." James and Catherine's eyes met over Rosie's head. The invitation hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Catherine heard herself accept before her brain could intervene with all the logical reasons she should return to her own apartment, her own life, the crisis she'd created by walking away. At his building, James paused at the door. "Rosie's probably wondering if we abandoned her. You could come up, have dinner." Catherine heard the invitation underneath the invitation. She'd spent 2 nights on his couch, eaten his food, let his granddaughter call her mom cat. At some point, they'd crossed from strangers into something more complicated. She voiced the concern building since Friday. "James, I just blew up my career to chase meaning I'm not sure I know how to find. I'm probably going to fail spectacularly." James smiled. "Margaret was a disaster when I met her. Crying in the rain, convinced she'd never amount to anything. Sometimes disasters are just people figuring out which direction they're supposed to grow." They climbed the stairs together. Rosie launched herself at them full of updates about Mrs. Chen's cat. Over spaghetti dinner, Catherine found herself laughing at the girl's stories, contributing observations existing in a present moment that didn't require performance. After dinner, Rosie begged to show Catherine her room. It was small, painted pale yellow, filled with books and stuffed animals and drawings taped to every available surface. A shelf held trophies from piano competitions and participation ribbons from school events. Photographs showed Rosie at various ages, always with James, sometimes with other adults. Catherine assumed were the parents who'd died. One photo caught her attention, a young couple, late 20s maybe, standing in front of Niagara Falls. The man had James's eyes. The woman had Rosie's smile. Rosie saw her looking, "That's my mom and dad. They died in a car crash when I was 5. I don't remember them super well, but Grandpa tells me stories. He says they would have loved who I'm becoming." Catherine's throat closed around words that wouldn't come. She managed, "They would be so proud of you." Rosie accepted this with the pragmatism of a child who'd already done the hard work of grief. "Grandpa says everyone we love stays with us in how we choose to live. So I try to be brave like my dad and kind like my mom and stubborn like Grandma Margaret because she never gave up even when cancer hurt really bad." 7 years old and already more emotionally intelligent than Catherine had managed in 42. The girl had experienced more loss than most adults, yet still approached each day with openness and trust. Rosie pulled out a photo album, flipped to a specific page. "This is Grandma Margaret when she was young. Grandpa keeps telling me the story of how they met." The photograph showed a young woman, mid-20s, drenched in rain. She stood on a street corner, mascara, running hair plastered to her face. Behind her, barely visible, a younger James held out what looked like a jacket. Rosie's finger traced the image. "Grandma went to an interview to be a nurse. They said she was too quiet, not confident enough. She was walking home crying when it started raining. Grandpa saw her and stopped even though he had an important meeting. He says she looked like she needed someone to care and everyone else had just walked past." Catherine stared at the photograph, seeing herself reflected in Margaret's expression. Lost, overwhelmed, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so fast. Rosie continued, oblivious to the impact of her words. "Grandpa says some people come into your life like rain. They wash away the old stuff so new things can grow. Grandma was his rain, he was hers." The metaphor landed with precision. Catherine had thought of last night's rain as punishment, catastrophe, the universe punishing her for ambition. But maybe it had been washing something away, making space for something different to take root. James appeared in the doorway. "Time for bed, Squirt. Catherine's probably exhausted from your tour." Rosie hugged Catherine with the easy affection of someone who hadn't learned yet to guard her heart. Catherine hugged back, surprised by how natural it felt. After Rosie was tucked in, James and Catherine found themselves on the small balcony outside his living room. The city spread before them, lights reflecting off wet pavement from earlier showers. Somewhere out there was Catherine's penthouse, her office, the life she'd built and abandoned in the span of 18 hours. James broke the silence. "You can't hide here forever. Eventually you'll have to decide what you're actually doing." Catherine knew he was right. "Preston's probably convinced the board I've had some kind of breakdown. He'll position himself as the stable choice, the responsible adult who can clean up my mess. By Monday, I'll be either fired or on indefinite leave with reduced authority. Either way, I'm watching 20 years of work disappear because I couldn't stand at a podium and smile through his arrogance. James leaned against the balcony railing. Is it worth fighting for? The question cut straight to bone. Catherine wanted to say yes, automatically defend her company and her reputation and everything she'd sacrificed to build success. But honesty demanded better. I don't know. 2 days ago I would have said absolutely. Now I wonder if I've been fighting to keep something that was already dead. Or maybe I'm just scared that without the company I don't know who I am. James's expression softened. Margaret said something similar when she had to stop working. She'd been a nurse for 22 years. Defined herself by healing people. Then chemo made her too weak to work, and she had this crisis about what remained when you took away the job. Took her months to understand that the work was just what she did. Who she was lived somewhere deeper. Catherine felt tears threatening again. What if I dig down and there's nothing there? What if I'm just ambition and strategic thinking with no actual substance underneath? James turned to face her fully. Then you'd be the first person in history to build a $50 million company without being able to connect with people on some level. Business isn't just spreadsheets. It's understanding what people need and figuring out how to give it to them. You had that once, or you never would have succeeded. Question is whether it's still accessible. The observation settled something in Catherine's chest. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost, softness, vulnerability, the ability to trust, that she'd forgotten what she'd gained. She understood people, could read rooms, anticipate needs, create experiences that moved audiences. Those skills didn't vanish just because she'd spent years applying them to the wrong goals. Her tablet buzzed again. This time she looked Preston's subject line reading, "Final warning, board vote tomorrow 2 p.m. Catherine showed James the message. He read it, handed the tablet back. Tomorrow's Sunday. Catherine laughed, the sound bitter. Board meetings can happen any day. Preston's not waiting until Monday because he knows every hour I'm gone is another hour for me to come to my senses and fight back. He's forcing the issue while I'm still off balance. James considered this. So what do you want to do? There it was again. That same question he'd asked this morning, cutting through complexity to reach the simple truth underneath. What did Catherine want, stripped of expectations and obligations and fear? She looked out at Seattle's skyline, at buildings she'd hosted, events in neighborhoods she'd helped develop through strategic partnerships, a city she'd helped shape without ever really living in it. I want to show up tomorrow, not to fight for my old position, to propose something different, split the company, let Preston have the corporate division, the galas and product launches and everything I've grown to hate. I'll take the community work, the small events, the projects that actually matter but don't generate impressive revenue. James raised an eyebrow. That's going to cost you, financially, professionally. Catherine nodded. Everything that matters costs something. You taught me that. You gave up architecture for Margaret, not because it was strategic, but because some things are worth more than strategy. She drafted an email to her assistant, fingers steadier now. Schedule emergency board meeting Sunday, 2 p.m. I'll be presenting restructuring proposal. Make sure all board members attend. Before she could overthink it, she sent the message. James watched her, something like approval in his expression. You're really doing this. Catherine's hands shook slightly as she set down the tablet. I'm terrified, but I'm more terrified of going back to who I was yesterday. That woman was successful and lonely and so disconnected from anything real, she ended up drunk in the rain, wondering how she'd arrived at a life she didn't recognize. James reached over, squeezed her shoulder briefly. Tomorrow you'll face people who want you to fail. They'll question your judgment, your stability, your right to make decisions about a company you built. It's going to be brutal. Catherine met his eyes. I know, but I also know I can't keep living someone else's definition of success, even if that someone else is me from 20 years ago who didn't know any better. They sat together as night deepened, two people who'd stumbled into each other's orbits through rain and chance and the small kindnesses that changed trajectories. Tomorrow would bring its battles. Tonight there was just coffee growing cold and the distant sound of Rosie's music box playing through thin walls and the strange peace that came from choosing the hard thing because it was also the right thing. Catherine thought about Margaret's photograph, about rain washing away what was old to make room for what was new. She thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed telling her to stop being afraid. She thought about Rosie explaining that the people we love stay with us in how we choose to live. And for the first time in 20 years, Catherine felt like she might actually be choosing instead of just reacting, building instead of performing, becoming someone worth remembering instead of someone who'd simply won. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity Seattle rarely granted, sun breaking through clouds like it had scored a personal victory over the Pacific Northwest's perpetual gloom. Catherine woke on James's couch for the second time, but this morning carried different weight. Today she'd walk into a boardroom and either reclaim her company on new terms or watch 20 years of work dissolve because she'd finally admitted what she'd always known: success without meaning was just expensive emptiness. She dressed in clothes her assistant Melanie had delivered at dawn, summoned by an encrypted message Catherine had sent at 3 a.m. when sleep proved impossible. The navy suit felt like armor she'd worn so long it had fused with skin, but something had shifted. The woman buttoning this jacket understood what it cost to maintain the facade, understood that appearing invulnerable and actually being strong were entirely different achievements. James was already awake, measuring coffee grounds with the precision he probably applied to cutting wood. Rosie sat at the kitchen table working through a coloring book, tongue stuck out in concentration as she selected exactly the right shade of purple for a dragon's scales. James poured Catherine a mug without asking if she wanted it. Big day, board meetings on Sunday mean blood in the water. Catherine accepted the coffee, let the heat seep into palms that had been cold since she'd woken. Preston will have spent yesterday building his coalition. He'll paint me as unstable, unreliable. He'll have numbers showing how my absence cost the company. By the time I walk in, half the board will have already decided I'm finished. James leaned against the counter, studying her with that careful attention he gave furniture joints, checking for weak points that might fail under pressure. "But you've got a plan." Catherine nodded, pulled out the tablet where she'd spent most of last night drafting her proposal. The restructuring was elegant in its simplicity. Split Reed and Associates into 2 divisions. Preston could have the corporate events, the 6-figure galas, the product launches for tech companies with more capital than sense. Catherine would take community programming, nonprofit partnerships, the work that actually changed lives but didn't generate quarterly reports impressive enough to attract venture capital. She'd run the numbers 3 times. Her division would operate at lower margins, require more hands-on involvement, generate less revenue. On paper it looked like she was downgrading, accepting defeat disguised as strategic repositioning. But the numbers also showed sustainability, growth potential in markets Preston had always dismissed as unprofitable. Rosie looked up from her coloring. "Are you going to work? Grandpa says work on Sundays means someone's in trouble." Catherine managed a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "Something like that. I need to talk to some people about doing my job differently. They might not like what I have to say." Rosie considered this with the seriousness of someone whose worldview hadn't yet calcified around politeness. "Grandpa always says if you have to choose between doing something right and doing something easy, pick right, even if right is scary." James's expression flickered with something that might have been pride. "That's what Grandma Margaret used to tell me. Seems like it stuck." Catherine felt the weight of that inherited wisdom passed down from a woman who'd spent her final months choosing meaning over more time, quality over quantity, presence over preservation. Margaret had understood that life measured in heartbeats meant every single one counted, that you couldn't waste them performing a version of yourself designed to impress strangers. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at Reed & Associates headquarters, 23rd floor of a glass tower that reflected Seattle's skyline back at itself with architectural narcissism. Catherine arrived 30 minutes early, riding the elevator alone, watching floor numbers climb while her pulse did the same. Melanie waited in the lobby, tablet clutched like a shield, eyes red-rimmed in a way that suggested tears or insomnia or both. "Ms. Reed, I wasn't sure you'd actually show." Catherine heard the relief buried under professional composure. "I said I would. What's the temperature?" Melanie pulled up her notes, began reciting the landscape. Catherine had already guessed. Preston called an informal gathering yesterday. He's got Harrison and Cole locked down. They've never liked the community initiatives. Suspects he has Winters too, though she's playing neutral. That's 3 votes against you out of 8 board members. You need 5 to maintain CEO position. Catherine did the math. 8 board members plus Preston made 9 total decision makers. If Preston had 3 guaranteed votes plus his own, she needed all 4 remaining members to back her proposal. Possible but not probable, especially given she was asking them to accept reduced revenue in exchange for undefined social impact. The conference room occupied the building's northeast corner, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering views of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains beyond. On clear days you could see all the way to the peninsula. Today's clarity felt less like gift and more like exposure, nowhere to hide when everything was visible. Board members filtered in with the careful choreography of people who'd already chosen sides but hadn't yet admitted it publicly. Preston arrived, last suit, perfectly tailored expression, schooled into concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. He'd always been good at performing emotion while feeling nothing, a skill Catherine had once admired before understanding it was sociopathy dressed in business casual. He took the seat at the head of the table, the spot Catherine usually occupied, marking territory with the subtlety of a dog pissing on a fire hydrant. "Catherine, glad you could join us. We were worried after your Friday night disappearance." The room's attention swiveled to her. Catherine remained standing, refusing to sit in the diminished position Preston had choreographed. "I apologize for leaving the gala. It was unprofessional, but it was also necessary. I've spent the weekend evaluating what I want from this company and what this company needs from me. I don't believe those things align anymore." Preston's expression shifted, recalculating. "If you're here to resign, we can handle that cleanly. Severance package, non-compete waiver, smooth transition. No need for dramatics." Catherine met his gaze. Let him see she wasn't the woman who'd fled his announcement Friday night. "I'm not resigning. I'm proposing a restructuring that serves both the company's financial goals and my need to do work that actually matters." She pulled up her presentation, began walking them through the division proposal. Corporate events under Preston's leadership, continuing the high-margin work with Fortune 500 clients. Community programming under her guidance, pivoting toward nonprofits, local partnerships events that measured success and impact rather than revenue. The numbers were solid, her projections conservative. She'd factored in reduced overhead grant opportunities. Preston had never pursued partnership potential with organizations that had mission statements instead of profit motives. Harrison spoke first, his voice carrying the dismissive tone of someone who'd made millions in real estate and thought social impact was for people who couldn't hack real business. "With all respect, Catherine, this reads like a midlife crisis disguised as business strategy. You want to take a profitable company and split it so you can feel good about helping people who can't afford our services anyway." Catherine had expected this. "Our current model optimizes for quarterly returns. My proposal optimizes for sustainability. The corporate division maintains profit margins. The community division builds brand equity, generates positive press, creates pipeline for future corporate clients who value social responsibility. We're leaving money on the table by ignoring that market." Deborah Chen, youngest board member at 43, leaned forward. "I've reviewed your numbers. The community division shows 18% margins versus corporate's 42%. That's not sustainability, that's subsidizing feel-good work with money from actual profitable operations." Catherine felt the room shifting against her. She'd known the numbers would be her weakest argument. Quarterly thinking had colonized every boardroom in America, turned long-term investment into a liability and immediate returns into the only metric that mattered. Preston sensed the momentum moved to close. Catherine's proposal asks us to accept reduced overall returns so she can pursue projects that align with her personal values. That's admirable on a human level. But it's not fiduciary responsibility. We have investors, partners, employees whose livelihoods depend on this company maximizing value. I move. We accept Catherine's resignation with the generous severance package I outlined and move forward under unified leadership focused on profitability. The vote was forming. Catherine could see it in the way eyes avoided hers, in the subtle nods exchanged between Preston and Harrison. She'd walked in knowing this was possible, maybe even likely. But knowing and experiencing were different animals. Then the conference room door opened. A woman entered in a wheelchair, right side still weak but left hand gripping the armrest with determined strength. Constance Reed had clearly dressed herself with whatever coordination she'd recovered, blouse slightly askew, hair uncombed but present. Here. Choosing to show up when showing up mattered. The room froze. Board members exchanged confused glances. Preston's carefully maintained composure cracked around the edges. Catherine crossed to her mother. "Mom, you shouldn't be here. You're supposed to be resting." Constance's words came slower than her sharp mind wanted, but clear enough. "Heard you. Needed backup. Called your assistant. She arranged transport." Catherine glanced at Melanie hovering in the doorway. Her assistant offered a slight shrug. Apparently loyalty ran deeper than Catherine had realized. Constance maneuvered her wheelchair to the table. The board members shifted to make space, social conditioning overriding business calculation. She positioned herself where she could see everyone, then began speaking with the labored precision of someone fighting neural damage to deliver truth. "I know, most of you, watched Catherine build this company, pushed her to be hard, successful, told her caring was weakness." She paused, gathering strength. "I was wrong, made her afraid to be human. She became what I taught, rich, alone, miserable." Preston tried to interrupt. "Mrs. Reed, with all respect, this is a business meeting about operational structure. Your daughter's personal journey while touching isn't relevant to fiduciary." Constance cut him off, her working hand slapping the table with surprising force. "You think business exists, separate from human beings. You think quarterly reports matter more than whether people making them can sleep at night." The room went silent. Constance continued, each word a fight. "My daughter built something valuable, then spent years forgetting why she started. Friday night, she remembered. You want to punish her for being human instead of corporation." Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "No one's punishing anyone. We're making a rational business decision based on projected returns and operational efficiency." Constance's laugh came out harsh, damaged. "Rational. My husband was rational. Left me for younger woman. Rational decision for his happiness. Destroyed our family." Catherine learned rational means protect yourself, never need anyone, win, even if winning costs everything. She turned to face the board directly. "She's offering different path. Build something that lasts longer than quarterly reports. Touch lives instead of extract value. You think that's weakness." The challenge hung in air that felt suddenly thinner. Catherine wanted to stop her mother, protect her from the effort this speech clearly cost. But Constance wasn't finished. Her voice dropped, became almost intimate. "My stroke taught me something. When you're lying there, can't move, can't speak, you think about what mattered. Not money, not career, whether you left world better than you found it, whether people you loved knew it." She looked at Catherine, eyes bright. "My daughter is choosing better. Don't punish her for it." The speech ended with Constance clearly exhausted, slumping in her wheelchair. Catherine moved to help, but her mother waved her off, stubborn even in weakness. Preston recovered first. "That was moving, Mrs. Reed, truly. But emotion doesn't change the fundamental question. This board has a responsibility to maximize shareholder value. Catherine's proposal prioritizes personal fulfillment over profitability. We can't run a company on feelings." Catherine felt something ignite in her chest. anger mixed with clarity. "You're right, Preston. Feelings aren't enough. So let's talk facts. In 20 years, I've built this company from nothing to 50 million in annual revenue. I've done it by understanding what people actually need and figuring out how to deliver it. You're good at optimization, at extracting maximum value from existing relationships, but you've never built anything new. You don't know how." She pulled up another slide, one she'd prepared but hadn't planned to use unless necessary. "This shows our client acquisition over the past 5 years. 92% of new corporate clients came through referrals from community work I did pro bono. Companies want to partner with organizations that demonstrate values alignment. Our community division isn't charity. It's the most effective marketing we've never properly funded." The numbers were irrefutable. Even Harrison looked surprised. Catherine pressed her advantage. "You want me to choose between profitability and meaning? I'm telling you, they're not mutually exclusive. They're interconnected. The question is whether this board has the vision to see past next quarter's returns and build something that compounds over decades." Deborah spoke. Her tone shifted from skeptical to considering. "If the community division is essentially a loss leader generating corporate partnerships, why split it? Why not keep it integrated under unified leadership?" Catherine had hoped someone would ask, "Because Preston and I want fundamentally different things. He wants to maximize extraction. I want to maximize impact. Those strategies require different metrics, different timelines, different leadership styles. Keeping us locked together means one of us has to compromise core values. The split lets us both succeed on our own terms." Preston's jaw tightened. "This is ridiculous. Catherine wants to blow up a successful company because she had some kind of emotional breakthrough. We should be talking about how to transition her out gracefully, not entertaining proposals that cut our profit margins." The door opened again. This time a man in his 70s entered, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had logged hard decades. His flannel shirt was clean, but worn hands marked by a lifetime of manual labor. James had no business being at this meeting, no official reason for presence. Yet somehow his being there felt inevitable. He crossed to stand beside Constance's wheelchair. "Ma'am, your physical therapist is downstairs. Said you're supposed to be doing exercises, not corporate warfare." Constance smiled with the left side of her mouth. "Tell him, I'm doing different kind of therapy." James nodded, then looked at Preston with the calm assessment of someone who'd spent 30 years evaluating structural integrity. "I'm James Sullivan. Don't belong here. But I built Catherine's furniture yesterday while she told me about this company. Wanted to see what 20 years of her life looked like in a room." Preston's expression cycled through confusion to dismissal. "Security will escort you out if—" James continued, like Preston hadn't spoken. "Used to be an architect, won some awards, built buildings people said were impossible. Then my wife got cancer and I walked away from all of it because she asked me to choose. Buildings or her, career or love. I chose her." He paused, let that sink in. "Everyone told me I was destroying my legacy, throwing away everything I'd built. But here's what I learned. This court values contracts, but character that's built over decades, not signed in minutes." The parallel was so obvious it landed like physical blow. Catherine watched board members make the connection. She'd chosen meaning over money, just like James had chosen Margaret over architecture. James wasn't finished. "You people are trying to decide if caring about something beyond profit makes Catherine unfit to lead. I'm here to tell you that's exactly backward. Woman who only cares about winning will eventually destroy everything she touches. Woman who understands some things matter more than quarterly returns. She's the only kind of leader worth following." Harrison spoke, surprising everyone. "What did you build?" "When you were an architect." James listed projects Catherine recognized from research: the convention center expansion, 3 community centers, housing developments designed for sustainability over maximum profit. His work had prioritized people over prestige, function over flash. Harrison pulled up something on his tablet, studied it. Seattle Convention Center expansion, opened 2015, still considered one of the most innovative public spaces in the Pacific Northwest. "You designed that?" James nodded. "With a team. Good people who understood buildings should serve communities, not egos. Harrison set down his tablet. That building generates $70 million annually in economic impact. City studies show it revitalized 4 surrounding neighborhoods. You walked away from work like that. James met his eyes. I walked away from future work like that. But what I'd already built kept working, kept serving people. That's what good design does. It lasts longer than the person who made it. Catherine spoke into the silence James had created. I'm not asking this board to choose between profit and purpose. I'm asking you to understand they're the same thing when you extend your timeline past the next 12 months. The community division builds relationships that convert to corporate partnerships. Preston's division monetizes those relationships. We're not competing. We're symbiotic. Elena Martinez, who'd been silent through the entire meeting, leaned forward. I joined this board because Reed and Associates had a reputation for quality and integrity. Under Catherine's leadership, we've won awards, generated positive press, built genuine relationships with clients who stay loyal through market downturns. Under Preston's proposed leadership, we'd optimize for extraction. That works until it doesn't. Richard Kim nodded. Catherine's proposal shows vision beyond next quarter. That's what boards should reward, not punish. Marcus Washington, the 8th board member, pulled up his tablet. I've been running numbers while we talked. Catherine's projections are conservative. If the community division generates even half the corporate referrals she's claiming, overall company value increases 37% over 5 years. That's better return than Preston's optimization model, which shows diminishing returns as we exhaust existing client relationships. The math changed everything. Suddenly, Catherine wasn't asking them to sacrifice profit for purpose. She was showing them purpose-generated profit when you measured correctly. Preston's face went carefully blank, the expression of someone realizing they'd overplayed their hand. The numbers are speculative, based on assumptions about partnership conversion that may not materialize. Marcus shrugged. All business projections are speculative, but Catherine's assumptions are based on 20 years of demonstrated success building relationships. Preston's are based on extracting maximum value from existing relationships. One builds wealth, the other depletes it. Elena called for a vote on Catherine's proposal. 5 hands went up: Elena, Richard, Marcus, Deborah, and after a long pause, Harrison. Preston's faction had collapsed with only Cole and Winters supporting him. Catherine felt something release in her chest tension she'd been carrying for days, maybe years. She'd won, not by convincing them to sacrifice profit for meaning, but by showing them meaning was the most profitable long-term investment. Preston stood, straightened his tie. Fine, I'll run the corporate division, but I want complete operational independence. No interference from community programming, no shared resources beyond what's contractually mandated. Catherine nodded. Agreed. We'll formalize the split within 30 days. Until then, business continues as usual. The board members began filing out. Harrison paused beside James. The convention center work. If you'd kept going, built on that foundation, you could have been legendary. James smiled without humor. I am legendary, just not in ways that show up on architecture websites. My granddaughter knows I chose her grandmother over career advancement. That's the only legacy that matters. Harrison's expression shifted. My daughter asked me last month why I never come to her soccer games. I told her I was building wealth for her future. She said she'd rather have a dad who showed up. He left without waiting for response. Catherine watched him go, wondering if she'd just witnessed someone else's inflection point. Preston approached, voice low enough only Catherine could hear. This isn't over. When your community division doesn't deliver the numbers you promised, I'll be there to pick up the pieces. Catherine met his eyes without flinching. I hope you're wrong, Preston, for both our sakes. He left. Catherine suspected she'd seen the last of whatever professional relationship they'd maintained. James appeared with Constance's physical therapist. They helped her into the elevator while Catherine gathered her materials. In the lobby, Constance gripped Catherine's hand. Proud of you. Should have said that more often. Catherine knelt beside the wheelchair. You showed up when it mattered. That's worth more than words. The transport van took Constance away. James and Catherine stood on the sidewalk as afternoon burned into evening. James spoke first. "You did it, stood up for what mattered without backing down." Catherine felt the weight of what she'd just committed to. "I promised them 18% margins and corporate partnership conversion rates I've never formally tracked. If I'm wrong, they'll use it as proof that caring makes you a bad business person." James started walking. "Could happen. Or you could prove building things that matter is the best business model there is." They walked in companionable silence. Catherine's phone buzzed, but she ignored it. For once, the crisis could wait. At his building, James paused. "Rosie's probably wondering if we abandoned her. You could come up, have dinner. She'd want to hear about your meeting." Catherine heard the invitation underneath the invitation. She'd spent 2 nights on his couch, eaten his food, let his granddaughter call her mom cat. At some point, they'd crossed from strangers into something more complicated. She voiced the concern building since Friday. "James, I just blew up my career to chase meaning. I'm not sure I know how to find. I'm probably going to fail spectacularly, and I have no idea what I'm doing beyond knowing I can't keep doing what I was." James nodded like she'd confirmed something he already knew. "Okay." She pushed. "That doesn't concern you that I'm basically a disaster pretending to have a plan." James smiled. "Margaret was a disaster when I met her. Crying in the rain, convinced she'd never amount to anything. Sometimes disasters are just people figuring out which direction they're supposed to grow." Catherine said yes to dinner. They climbed the stairs and she realized she'd stopped thinking of it as his apartment. It had become a place where she belonged. Rosie launched herself at them full of updates about Mrs. Chen's cat. She grabbed Catherine's hand, pulled her toward drawings of the board meeting stick figures and dramatic arrows showing who won and who lost. They ate together at the table, built for 2 but accommodating 3. Rosie chattered about school while James listened with full attention. Catherine found herself relaxing into the rhythm, contributing observations existing in a present moment that didn't require performance. After Rosie was convinced that bedtime was non-negotiable, Catherine helped James clean dishes. They moved with coordination that suggested more practice than 2 days should provide. James spoke while putting away plates. "What happens now?" Catherine dried the last dish. 30 days to restructure. Hire staff, develop partnerships, create programming that delivers the impact I promised. It's going to be brutal." James leaned against the counter. "Sounds like building anything worthwhile." Catherine set down the towel. "I want to do it right. Not just perform caring, but actually make a difference. I'm going to need help figuring out what that looks like." James considered. "Then you learn. Talk to people doing that work. Figure out what they need. It's not complicated, just hard." She looked around his apartment at furniture built by hand, at photographs documenting love continuing after loss. This was what legacy actually looked like. Catherine asked the question forming since Friday. "Can I keep coming here to dinner while I'm figuring out the community division? I think I need reminders of what real life looks like." James's expression softened. "Doors always open. For dinner, for conversation, for whatever you need while you're rebuilding." The offer carried weight beyond simple words. Catherine understood she was being invited into something that looked like family, required nothing except showing up honestly. She said yes to future dinners, to continued presence, to whatever was growing between them that didn't have a name yet but felt more solid than anything she'd built professionally. Then she went home to her apartment, to the work of restructuring a company and rebuilding a self. But for the first time in 20 years, going home didn't feel like returning to empty silence. It felt like having somewhere to come back to. Catherine pulled up her laptop, began drafting the restructuring proposal. The work was hard, the stakes were high, the probability of failure was real, but she'd chosen right, and that made all the difference.